Hello, I'm Elaine Canyon, sweetly writing happily ever after, one book at a time. And in this video, I've got tips and tricks for discovery writers. I am so excited for this new series that I'm starting, and it is Thriving as a Discovery Writer. I don't want a discovery writer to ever think that if they're going to be a successful author, they have to learn how to plot. I don't think that they need to outline. I don't think that that needs to be the way that every discovery writer becomes an accomplished and successful author. Huge disclaimer, these are things that I have found that work for me as a discovery writer and for a lot of other discovery writers that I know and talk to and have been able to discuss this with. That is to say that it's not going to work for every discovery writer. One of the things that people misunderstand the most about discovery writing is that it is unique to each individual. There are going to be things that work and things that don't. And it's the same with every kind of author. Every writer and author is either going to fall somewhere on a spectrum of outlining to not outlining. And that means that what works for some is not going to work for others. So with that in mind, let's dive in. To start off, let's discuss what a discovery writer is. A discovery writer is also called a pantster, unfortunately, or someone who flies by the seat of their pants, someone who writes into the dark. These are people who do not outline. The one time I tried to outline a story, it's still sitting on my computer and I don't think I'm ever going to go back and finish it. That's kind of bad. But what matters here is that we're talking about people who usually don't know their whole story before they write it. They don't have chapters set out or beats set out. They just know one specific thing or maybe a few specific things, and that's what's getting them excited to write. Discovery writers are excited about what happens next. Sometimes they know what they're writing towards, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have a character in their mind, sometimes it's a storyline in their mind. It is very dependent on the individual, but it's an exciting way to write, and it's a way that you can embrace writing to help you finish things. I found for me specifically that being a discovery writer means I always finish a project, and I always finish it because I want to know what happens next. I want to know the ending. I want to know where it goes. And when I get to discover that in that first draft, it's exciting, even when I get stuck in the middle, because I always get stuck in the middle. Always. I think every author does. There might be a few wonderful people out there who are watching go, I never get stuck in the middle. Oh my gosh, you are amazing. I always get stuck in the middle. But it doesn't mean that you can't be successful as an author when you're a discovery writer. I think the exact opposite is true. And so I'm here in this series to share with you things to help you thrive as a discovery writer. My first tip is structure. Discovery writers thrive with structure. Now, before you turn off the video, because I know you're thinking, wait a minute, Elaine, you just said we're not plotting. No, we're not plotting. We're not outlining. I said structure. There's a lot of ways to give yourself structure as a discovery writer. One of the ways that helps me a lot is to study plot structures, to study character arcs, and to study archetypes, to study these things, not thinking about your book or whatever it is you're going to be writing. Don't focus on how it applies to you. Just learn. Study it, read the books, watch the YouTube videos, read the blog posts, go to writing conferences and go to the plot structure classes. Just learn it. And here's the cool thing. When I started doing this, I started doing it mostly because I had been hearing all of the advice to discovery writers, which was to stop being a discovery writer. And it was disheartening, but I thought, well, I want to be a published author, and if this is going to make my stories better, maybe I should do it. And then I have that one novel that I outlined that still sits there and will sit there on my Google Drive forever. It just will, because I don't have any desire to go back to it after I've outlined it. But what I learned when I said this doesn't work and I moved on to the next story was that all of that work I put into studying plot and studying plot structures and studying character archetypes and studying arcs for characters and the different things that go into what a lot of plotters and outliners do before they write a story, is it was in there. It was in my subconscious. And as I was discovery writing my novel, it started to follow some of these things. And it didn't follow them exactly. It wasn't constraining me and saying, well, no, I have to follow these things, because I had 5 or 6 different ones that I had been studying. But it gave my story a lot of that same structure. It gave my story the arc that it needed. And it was one of the best things I had ever written. And then the next thing after that was one of the best things I'd ever written. And I started seeing real progress every single time I put down more words and came up with the next story and came up with the next story, to the point where I finally got a book where I was like, this is fun and this is marketable and publishable, and I could actually take this and edit this and put this to market. And that's the book that's going to be published hopefully by the end of this year, if I can keep my timeline going. So having the structure made all the difference. And it wasn't that I was holding myself to a structure. I wasn't being rigid, but my brain knew a lot of the structure now. And so my brain naturally gave me structure, which was awesome and exciting to realize that it was doing it on its own. My brain was creating a story on its own, but this time it was doing it in a way where I could be marketable with that story, where that story could actually be something that someone else would read and it would make sense, and it didn't have as much of the fluff in it that some of my earlier stories ended up having, because I was just sort of going where my heart led me. I was following the rule of cool. If you've ever watched Brandon Sanderson, he has the rule of cool. And I was following that, but it wasn't keeping me grounded inside of a structure. And by studying structure, my subconscious did that for me. So that is my number one suggestion, is to study structure. Find a way for you to enjoy learning about story types and genre expectations and plot archetypes and character archetypes and different arcs that characters can go through. Learn all that stuff, because your brain will use it as you discovery write, and your brain will create amazing stories, discovery written stories, with all of that plot and structure that an outliner puts at the beginning. Now, suggestion number 2, now that you haven't gone away from the video because I said structure, don't go away this time. Suggestion number 2 is boundaries. And boundaries can be loose. So when I say boundaries, I'm not saying that you are going to lock yourself in a box. That's not what we're saying at all. All we're saying is we've got this wonderful, huge field, and we're going to play in the daffodils, or we're going to play in the pasture grass, or we're going to pick where we're playing. And sometimes that boundary can be as wide as genre. That is one of mine, because I use this. I use boundaries to help me. One of my boundaries is genre. I write in fantasy romance. That means that every book I write is going to feature 2 main characters, and those 2 main characters are going to start off at the beginning of the book not together, and at the end of the book they will be together, and they will either have a happily ever after or a happily for now. So that is a genre boundary, and that tells me that I'm going to follow a certain path. It tells me where I'm playing. And that is a genre boundary. And all that does is it tells me where I'm playing. I'm playing in the daffodils. Now that was just the romance side of it. I get to add the fantasy side of it too. And so fantasy has other expectations, like magic needs to be involved in some way, shape, or form. And so now I can say, okay, well now I get to play in the daffodils, and I also get the rose bushes, and I get both. And that is a great way to give yourself boundaries. Some boundaries can be a little bit more specific. I am an underwriter, and there will be a video later on about what the difference is between underwriting and overwriting, and especially how that relates to discovery writing. But an underwriter tends to write less than the story actually needs. So one of my boundaries is word count. I'm not allowed to move on from a chapter until it is 4,000 words long. Now, all 4,000 words need to be story specific. So I also hold myself in the boundary that those 4,000 words can't just be me going off on a tangent. They have to be specific to the two characters inside of fantasy romance as a genre. And so those boundaries, those 3 boundaries, are what move me through every story. And they keep me from ending up with a steampunk book on accident, where I start with a fantasy romance book and I end in a steampunk book. I don't want to end up doing that. Not that there's anything against steampunk, and I might write that at some point. I've had some ideas. But I don't want to start with one book and end with another. And having boundaries helps me do that. So I'm not giving myself a rigid outline. That's not what I'm doing at all. What I'm saying is I get to play as much as I want. But for this book, I need to play here. And sometimes I don't know those boundaries when I start, especially before I realized that romance was what I loved writing. Because my first few attempts at writing were very much out in the open. Like, I gave myself permission to have no boundaries the first few times I wrote. And that was a good experience. And I highly suggest that. I highly suggest taking time to take off all boundaries and just explore, because that's one of the ways we find what we like. And you find that through reading and other things too. But as an author, you can find a lot of new ground by giving yourself permission to go everywhere. Now, that does take time. And if you don't have the time to say, oh, it's okay, the next 2 or 3 months I'm going to spend just writing whatever comes to mind, then maybe you start implementing those boundaries first thing. But as a discovery writer, those boundaries are there to keep you moving forward. If you have specific boundaries, and they can be broad boundaries, genre is a huge boundary. But if you have those boundaries, then they help guide you through. Trope is another great boundary. And romance has the benefit here because there are so many amazing tropes in romance that we get to enjoy and love. And they help drive your story. A friends to lover trope is going to give you a lot of boundaries. The boundary is that when you start off, you need to establish these characters are friends. And then by the end of it, they need to be lovers, or enemies to lovers, or there's only one bed, or the nanny trope, or there's tons of them. So many. Fake marriage, that's one of my favorite. Fake marriage and secret relationship. So many like that are amazing. Second chance, those boundaries help to keep you moving forward without giving you an outline, without making you sit down and say, okay, character A and character B have to do this in chapter 1, and then they have to do this in chapter 2, and then they have to do this in chapter 3. And that's just so constricting. You don't have to do that. Boundaries can be broad. And as a discovery writer, they help me when they're broad. The more constricting that those boundaries get, the worse off I am. I can't handle it when a boundary is so hard set. But when it's a general and broad boundary where my characters get to grow into it, then my stories move forward and I finish books. So to wrap it up, structure and boundaries, but not constricting structure, not constricting boundaries. All we're doing is studying structure so that we know, and our subconscious knows, and we're giving ourselves general and broad boundaries to help us move through our stories and finish them. There is so much more that I hope to share with you as a discovery writer to help you thrive. If that's something that you're interested in learning more about, hit the subscribe button And we're going to see you again on Wednesday with another video that will help you thrive as a discovery writer.